If I had to pick just one supplement that has the strongest scientific case for brain health, like not for muscles or joints or longevity in general, but specifically for the brain, I think there's a very strong argument that it's DHA. Now, you may not know what DHA is yet, but you've almost certainly heard of fish oil, and DHA is one of the major omega-3 fats found in fish oil, and the story turns out to be way more interesting than just saying, hey, fish oil is good for you. Because the science says timing matters, dose matters, testing matters. And if you're waiting until memory problems already start, you may be missing the window where DHA helps the most. In fact, one study that really stopped me in my tracks followed participants in the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. They looked at the data from 48 different studies and found that people who had been taking omega-3 supplements long-term had a 64% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, before everyone just runs out and starts buying fish oil by the gallon, let's pump the brakes for a second. That study was observational, right? It wasn't an intervention study, it was just observing people who take fish oil. So that doesn't prove that fish oil actually prevents Alzheimer's disease, because people who take omega-3 supplements for years may also exercise and eat healthier diets and sleep better and generally take better care of themselves. So we can't make firm conclusions from these observational studies because of something called the healthy user bias, right? Those people may just live a healthier life. But I do think it raises a really important question, because what if something is here? What if one of the most important nutrients for brain health isn't some exotic compound you've never heard of, but something hiding in plain sight? Now, I've been fascinated by this topic for a really long time, partly because I'm a clinician, partly because I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to digging into the literature and trying to figure out what actually moves the needle when it comes to preserving health as we age. But if I'm being honest with you, part of my interest in this topic isn't necessarily just academic at all. It's actually more personal, so I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Because before we talk about Alzheimer's disease, genetics, inflammation, and why I think most people are approaching omega-3s completely backwards, we have to first answer a very basic question. What is DHA? So DHA stands for docosahexaenoic acid. It's one of the major omega-3 fats found in fish oil. But calling DHA just another omega-3 is a little bit like calling Novak Djokovic just another tennis player. I mean, technically true, but you're really missing the point. Your brain seems weirdly obsessed with DHA. About 40% of the fatty acids in your brain's gray matter are DHA. Now think about that for a second. The organ that stores your memories, recognizes faces of the people you love, helps you solve problems and make jokes, and makes you uniquely you, is built in part from this one nutrient. DHA doesn't just sit there and look pretty. It helps neurons talk to each other. It supports the resolution of inflammation, and it maintains a healthy environment inside the brain. And while Alzheimer's disease is obviously much more complicated than just one nutrient, it's hard to imagine giving your brain the best chance it has if one of the most important building blocks of the brain is deficient. So DHA isn't just some nutrient floating around in the background. DHA is part of the raw material your brain is built from. And when researchers look at the actual levels of omega-3s in real humans, the findings become really interesting. One of my favorite studies on this came out in the Framingham heart study. Researchers measured red blood cell omega-3 levels in more than 2,000 adults with an average age of only 46 years old. So these weren't like nursing home residents. These weren't Alzheimer's patients. These were middle-aged adults. And the people with the highest omega-3 fatty acid levels had larger hippocampal volumes and better performance on tests of abstract reasoning. Now, the hippocampus is one of the most important memory structures in the brain, and it's one of the first regions that's affected by Alzheimer's disease. And again, these findings were showing up decades before dementia. And that really changes the conversation, because most of us think that Alzheimer's disease is something that, starts when your memory starts slipping. But what if that process starts much earlier? What if by the time symptoms show up, We're already years or even decades behind. And that's why I keep coming back to this idea that timing matters. Now, one of the most fascinating parts of the DHA story has to do with inflammation, because most people think that inflammation is like a fire, and the goal becomes, how do I put out that fire? But that's not actually how biology works. Inflammation isn't supposed to last forever. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And the ending isn't just passive. Your body actually creates active molecules whose job it is to tell the immune system, okay, threat handled, time to clean up the mess and return things back to normal. And DHA serves as a precursor to those compounds that do that job. They're called specialized pro-resolving mediators, or SPMs. They include resolvins, merisins, and neuroprotectin D1. And these compounds help coordinate the active resolution of inflammation and support neuronal survival. They're the cleanup crew. And if you want to go deeper into the science of inflammation resolution, I actually made an entire video on that topic before, so you can check it out here. You can click that and watch that video. Now, eventually, someone watching this video may be thinking, okay, this all sounds great, but what about randomized controlled trials? What about intervention studies where people take omega-3s? And obviously that's a fair question, right? That's what I mentioned earlier. Those observational studies, they can only take us so far. So a meta-analysis, which is a study that looks at a whole bunch of other studies done by Yurko Maro and colleagues, they looked at DHA either alone or combined with EPA, which is another fatty acid, and memory outcomes in adults. And they found that episodic memory improved in adults with mild memory complaints. They also found that doses above 1 gram per day of DHA and EPA improved episodic memory. Now, episodic memory is the kind of memory that people often notice changing first. Where's my keys? Why did I walk into this room? What was that person's name again? Now, forgetting why you walked into the kitchen doesn't automatically mean you have an omega-3 deficiency. Sometimes it just means you're 50 years old and your brain currently has 17 browser tabs open. But these findings suggest that DHA may have its greatest benefit earlier in the process rather than after significant damage has already occurred. And in patients with mild cognitive impairment, supplementation with 2 grams of DHA has been associated with improvements in cognition and slower hippocampal atrophy. In other words, shrinking of that part of the brain called the hippocampus that's involved in memory. So again, it's not a cure, it's not magic, but certainly enough evidence to make me pay attention. Because as I told you earlier, this topic isn't just entirely academic for me. The truth is, my dad lives in a memory care center. He doesn't know who I am anymore. He doesn't know who anybody is anymore. So when I ask if there's anything we can do to support brain health before cognitive decline begins, I'm not just asking out of idle curiosity. I don't know whether DHA would have changed my dad's story, and nobody else can answer that question. Because Alzheimer's disease is complicated, right? Dementia is complicated. Sleep matters, exercise matters, blood sugar matters, blood pressure matters, smoking matters, education matters, social connections matter, head injuries matter. There's a lot of variables. So I actually made a much more detailed video talking about all of these other factors. And if you want to watch that one, again, you can find it here. But if understanding this science today helps someone preserve more years with the people they love tomorrow, then I think it's worth talking about. Now, another factor that goes into Alzheimer's and dementia is genetics, right? This is another fascinating piece of the story with DHA, because many of you have probably heard of ApoE4. It's the strongest genetic factor for late onset Alzheimer's disease. And what's interesting is that ApoE4 is involved in lipid transport. In other words, it helps move fats around the body and in the brain. And emerging evidence suggests that people carrying the ApoE4 variant may process DHA differently. And some studies suggest that they have faster DHA turnover and altered delivery to the brain. Now, one study found that elderly ApoE4 carriers had whole body DHA half-life that was 77% shorter than non-carriers. In other words, they process DHA a lot faster. And if that's true, it raises a really important possibility. The people who may benefit the most from optimizing DHA could also be the very people who are genetically at higher risk. Now let's talk about the single biggest mistake people make with omega-3s. They guess, right? They say, well, I take fish oil. Okay, how do you know that that's enough? How do you know if you're absorbing it? How do you know it's changing your physiology? How do you know you're absorbing fats properly and processing them properly, right? I test almost all my patients, and in my experience, unless someone is actually already taking fish oil supplements consistently or eating a ton of fatty fish regularly, I'd say about 80 to 90% of my patients come back low on their blood work. Now, that's not obviously a published study. That's just my experience after testing many people. But it lines up pretty well with the broader literature showing that low omega-3 status is incredibly common. So the philosophy becomes very simple. Test, don't guess, right? If levels are low, increase intake and then retest, because the goal isn't to just collect supplements. The goal is to change physiology. And people often ask, well, I just eat more fish. Absolutely. Food first whenever possible. Salmon, sardines, trout, anchovies, herring, mackerel, they're all fantastic foods. The problem is most people don't eat them consistently enough. Even among people who eat fish regularly, blood levels can vary dramatically due to differences in absorption and body size and genetics and metabolism and consistency, which brings us right back to testing. Because if you care about your brain, I don't think guessing is a particularly good strategy. Now, does everyone need DHA supplementation? No. Obviously, there's situations where high-dose omega-3 supplementation deserves caution, right? If you're on blood thinners, if you have bleeding disorders, if you're preparing for surgery, or if you have specific cardiac concerns, talk to your healthcare provider or talk to me. I don't want this video to become everyone should be taking, everything forever. That's not how I think. The point isn't that DHA cures Alzheimer's disease. The point is that DHA is one of the most important structural fats in the human brain. Higher blood levels are associated with healthier brain markers in middle age. Higher intake has also been shown to be associated with lower rates of cognitive decline in these large observational studies. And randomized trials suggest the benefits may be greater earlier in the process rather than later. And by the time dementia develops, we're often trying to rescue a system that's been under stress for decades. Because prevention isn't nearly as exciting as rescue. It doesn't make headlines. It isn't sexy. But prevention is where we have the greatest opportunity. Because the goal isn't just to live longer. The goal is to stay connected to the people you love for as long as possible. And if there's even a chance that understanding DHA today can help someone preserve a few more years later, a few more memories, I think that's a conversation worth having.